The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as Prince William walked briskly through the ancient corridors. His footsteps echoed against the stone walls, each step more determined than the last. Something had been troubling him for weeks, and today he had finally decided to take action. Sergeant Marcus Thompson had been part of the Royal Guard for 8 years. He stood at attention outside the prince's private office, his red uniform pristine and his expression stoic. But behind that professional facade, Marcus harbored secrets that would soon shake the very foundations of the monarchy. William had first noticed the irregularities 3 weeks earlier during a routine security briefing. Small things at first: missing reports, unexplained absences, and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room. His military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and those instincts were now screaming that something was very wrong. The prince had spent his morning reviewing security footage from the castle's extensive surveillance system. What he discovered made his blood run cold. There, captured in grainy black and white, was clear evidence of Sergeant Thompson's betrayal. The guard had been photographing confidential documents, copying security protocols, and worst of all, meeting with unauthorized individuals in areas strictly forbidden to outsiders. Catherine had noticed her husband's growing concern over the past few days. She had tried to discuss it with him over breakfast, but William had remained tight-lipped about the details. The weight of what he had discovered was enormous, and he knew that once he acted, there would be no going back. The royal security team had been briefed on the situation in utmost secrecy. Chief Security Officer James Morrison sat across from William in the oak-paneled study, his face grave as they discussed the implications. The breach of security was not just a personal betrayal. It threatened the safety of the entire royal family and potentially compromised national security. William's phone buzzed with a message from his private secretary. The meeting with Sergeant Thompson had been arranged for 11 o'clock sharp. The prince looked at his watch. It was already 10:30. He had exactly 30 minutes to prepare for what would undoubtedly be one of the most difficult conversations of his royal career. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed unusual deposits into Thompson's account over the past 6 months. Phone records revealed contact with known tabloid journalists and foreign nationals with questionable backgrounds. Most damning of all were the photographs found on Thompson's personal device, images of classified security layouts, royal family schedules, and sensitive communication protocols. As William prepared for the confrontation, he reflected on the trust that had been broken. Thompson had been personally vetted by the Royal Security Service. He had undergone extensive background checks and psychological evaluations. He had sworn an oath of loyalty to the crown and had been entrusted with the safety of William's own children. The betrayal cut deep, not just professionally but personally. The prince's military experience had taught him how to handle difficult situations with subordinates, but this was different. This wasn't just about military discipline. This was about protecting his family and preserving the integrity of an institution that had stood for over 1,000 years. The monarchy had survived wars, scandals, and political upheavals, but it had always relied on the absolute loyalty of those sworn to protect it. Chief Morrison knocked softly on the study door. It was time. William straightened his tie and walked toward what he knew would be a confrontation that would change everything. The castle seemed unusually quiet as they made their way to the small conference room where Sergeant Thompson was waiting. The sergeant stood at attention as William entered the room, his face showing no emotion. But William could see something in the man's eyes, a flicker of recognition that suggested Thompson knew why he had been summoned. The prince took his seat across from the guard, the evidence folder placed deliberately on the table between them. William began slowly, his voice steady but cold. He outlined what had been discovered, watching as Thompson's composure gradually cracked. The sergeant's hands began to tremble slightly, and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. The confession, when it came, was both shocking and heartbreaking. Thompson revealed a gambling addiction that had spiraled out of control. Massive debts to dangerous people had left him desperate and vulnerable to blackmail. What had started as selling minor information to tabloid journalists had escalated into something far more serious when foreign agents had approached him with offers he felt he couldn't refuse. William listened in stunned silence as Thompson described how he had been recruited by individuals claiming to represent various international interests. They had promised him enough money to pay off his debts and start fresh in another country. All he had to do was provide regular updates on royal family movements, security procedures, and any information that might be of value to their clients. The sergeant broke down completely as he realized the full extent of his betrayal. He had put not just the royal family at risk, but also his fellow guards and staff members who had trusted him. His actions had potentially compromised ongoing security operations and endangered the lives of innocent people. William felt a mixture of anger and disappointment as he processed what he was hearing. This wasn't just about one man's poor choices. It was about a fundamental breach of the trust that formed the backbone of the entire royal security apparatus. Every protocol would need to be reviewed, every procedure questioned, and every person with access to sensitive information revetted. The immediate decision was clear. Sergeant Thompson would be suspended from duty effective immediately, pending a full investigation by both royal security and the appropriate government agencies. His access to all royal properties would be revoked, and he would be escorted from the premises within the hour. As Thompson was led away, William remained in the conference room, staring at the evidence spread across the table. The real work was just beginning. The palace would need to conduct a comprehensive review of all security procedures, and difficult questions would need to be answered about how such a breach had been allowed to occur. The prince knew that this incident would have far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the walls of Windsor Castle. News of Sergeant Thompson's suspension spread through the palace like wildfire. Within hours of his dismissal, every member of the royal household staff was buzzing with speculation and concern. The official announcement was deliberately vague, citing only security concerns and breach of protocol, but the implications were clear to everyone who worked within the castle walls. Prince William called an emergency meeting with his senior staff and security team that evening. The ornate conference room, usually reserved for state matters, felt heavy with tension as key personnel filed in. Chief Security Officer Morrison, Private Secretary Simon Hayes, and several department heads gathered around the mahogany table, their faces reflecting the gravity of the situation. The prince wasted no time in addressing the elephant in the room. Thompson's betrayal had exposed critical vulnerabilities in their security infrastructure that needed immediate attention. Every access point, every clearance level, and every trusted individual would need to be scrutinized. The process would be extensive, expensive, and potentially embarrassing for the institution. Catherine entered the room quietly, taking a seat beside her husband. As a senior member of the royal family, she needed to understand the full scope of the crisis. Her presence added another layer of complexity to the situation. The security breach hadn't just affected William, but potentially put their children at risk as well. Morrison presented a preliminary assessment of the damage. Thompson had accessed files containing detailed schedules for the next 6 months, including private family events, school activities for Prince George and Princess Charlotte, and security arrangements for upcoming public engagements. The sergeant had also photographed architectural plans of several royal residences, information that could be invaluable to anyone with malicious intent. The financial implications were staggering. Beyond the immediate costs of conducting a comprehensive security review, the palace would need to implement entirely new protocols. Electronic access systems would need to be replaced, background check procedures would need to be enhanced, and additional oversight measures would need to be put in place to prevent similar breaches in the future. William's phone rang continuously throughout the meeting as word of the suspension began to leak beyond the palace walls. His private secretary fielded calls from government security agencies, senior members of the royal household, and media representatives who had somehow caught wind of unusual activity at the castle. Each call brought new complications and questions that needed careful handling. The psychological impact on the remaining security staff was perhaps the most concerning immediate effect. Men and women who had served loyally for years suddenly found themselves under suspicion. The trust and camaraderie that had defined the Royal Protection Unit had been shattered by Thompson's betrayal. Morale plummeted as guards began to question whether their colleagues harbored similar secrets. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins from the Metropolitan Police arrived at the castle just after midnight. Her specialized unit handled matters of national security, and Thompson's case had been flagged as potentially involving foreign intelligence services. The investigation would now expand beyond the palace walls, bringing unwanted scrutiny from multiple government agencies. William briefed Inspector Collins personally, sharing the evidence that had led to Thompson's suspension. The detective's expression grew increasingly serious as she reviewed the photographs, bank records, and communication logs. What had initially appeared to be a case of simple corruption was beginning to look like something far more sophisticated and dangerous. The media attention intensified throughout the night. Photographers gathered outside the castle gates, hoping to capture images of the unusual late-night activity. Social media buzzed with speculation about everything from terrorist threats to family scandals. The palace press office worked overtime to manage the narrative while revealing as little as possible about the ongoing investigation. By dawn, 3 more security personnel had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Thompson's betrayal had created a domino effect, with investigators uncovering a network of questionable associations and financial irregularities among other staff members. What had started as an isolated incident was becoming a systematic review of the entire royal security apparatus. The Queen was briefed on the situation during her morning coffee. Despite her advanced age, Her Majesty remained sharp and asked pointed questions about the implications for the monarchy's reputation. The conversation between grandmother and grandson was tense, with both understanding that the decisions made in the coming days would have lasting consequences for the institution they both served. Prince Charles was equally concerned when William called to update him on the developing situation. As heir to the throne, Charles understood better than most how security breaches could undermine public confidence in the monarchy. The conversation quickly turned to damage control strategies and the need for complete transparency with relevant government authorities. The palace's legal team was assembled to address the complex web of issues arising from Thompson's suspension. Employment law, national security regulations, and royal protocols all intersected in ways that required careful navigation. The lawyers warned that the case could drag on for months, keeping the scandal in the public eye far longer than anyone wanted. International implications began to emerge as investigators traced Thompson's contacts to individuals in several foreign countries. Diplomatic channels buzzed with concerned communications as allied governments sought to understand whether their own security had been compromised. The sergeant's betrayal was no longer just a British problem. It had become an international incident. Staff members throughout the royal household began to feel the effects of heightened security measures. Background checks were initiated for hundreds of employees, from senior advisors to kitchen staff. Access to certain areas of the palace was restricted, and new identification procedures were implemented. The warm, family-like atmosphere that had characterized the royal household was replaced by an environment of suspicion and scrutiny. William found himself questioning decisions he had made as Thompson's supervisor. Had there been warning signs he had missed? Could the betrayal have been prevented with better oversight? The weight of responsibility for his family's safety and the security of the institution pressed heavily on his shoulders. The suspension had exposed not just Thompson's individual failings, but systemic weaknesses in how the royal household managed security personnel. Procedures that had seemed adequate for decades were suddenly revealed as outdated and insufficient for the modern world. The entire security infrastructure would need to be rebuilt from the ground up. As the second day of the crisis dawned, William realized that Thompson's suspension was just the beginning of a long and difficult process that would test the monarchy's resilience in ways no one had anticipated. The third day brought revelations that stunned even the most experienced members of the royal security team. Detective Inspector Collins discovered that Thompson's network extended far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. The suspended sergeant had been part of a sophisticated operation that had been quietly gathering intelligence on the royal family for over 2 years. Phone records revealed regular contact between Thompson and at least 6 other individuals across 3 different countries. Encrypted messaging apps had been used to transmit sensitive information, and cryptocurrency payments had been made to offshore accounts in Thompson's name. The operation showed a level of planning and coordination that suggested professional intelligence gathering rather than opportunistic corruption. William paced the length of his private study as Collins briefed him on the latest discoveries. Each new piece of evidence painted a more disturbing picture of how thoroughly the palace's security had been compromised. The sergeant hadn't just been selling information, he had been systematically mapping the royal family's entire security apparatus for unknown foreign interests. The investigation team had grown to include representatives from MI5, the Metropolitan Police Counterterrorism Unit, and specialists from the Government Communications Headquarters. The small conference room that had hosted Thompson's confrontation was transformed into a command center, with computers, communication equipment, and evidence boards covering every available surface. Catherine's schedule had to be completely revised as security analysts determined which upcoming engagements might have been compromised. A charity gala planned for the following week was postponed, and several private family events were moved to different locations. The children's school was quietly notified of potential security concerns, adding another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Public interest in the story intensified as journalists began connecting dots that the palace had hoped to keep separate. A tabloid newspaper published photographs of Thompson entering a London hotel, where he had allegedly met with his foreign contacts. The images, grainy and taken from a distance, nevertheless provided visual confirmation of the sergeant's betrayal that made the story more tangible. For the general public, the Queen's private secretary called an urgent meeting with senior household officials to discuss the growing crisis. The monarch was concerned not just about immediate security implications, but about the long-term damage to the institution's reputation. Every major scandal in recent royal history was analyzed for lessons on how to manage public perception during times of crisis. Meanwhile, Thompson himself had disappeared from his London apartment. Neighbors reported seeing him leave with 2 suitcases in the early hours of the morning, and his mobile phone had been switched off since his suspension. The discovery that he had fled raised the stakes considerably. A cooperative witness had become a fugitive, potentially carrying valuable intelligence to unknown destinations. International law enforcement agencies were alerted to Thompson's disappearance. Passport control systems at major airports were flagged with his details, and border security services across Europe were notified of his potential movements. The case had evolved from a domestic security breach into an international manhunt with diplomatic implications. William's military background proved invaluable as he worked with security professionals to assess the damage and plan countermeasures. His experience in military intelligence helped him understand the sophisticated nature of the operation they were dealing with. This wasn't amateur hour. Thompson had been working with professionals who understood how to exploit vulnerabilities in high security environments. The psychological pressure on remaining security staff reached a breaking point when 2 more guards requested transfers to other duties. The atmosphere of suspicion and constant questioning had made their jobs nearly impossible. Morale among the protection team hit rock bottom as officers who had served faithfully for years found themselves treated as potential threats. Chief Morrison submitted his resignation, accepting responsibility for the security failures that had allowed Thompson's betrayal to continue undetected. His departure removed one of the most experienced security professionals in the royal household, just when his expertise was most needed. William reluctantly accepted the resignation while beginning the search for a replacement who could rebuild trust and implement new safeguards. The palace's relationship with law enforcement agencies became strained as investigators demanded access to areas and information that had traditionally been considered off-limits. Constitutional questions arose about the extent to which the royal household could be subjected to criminal investigation. Legal precedents dating back centuries were examined to determine the proper balance between security needs and royal privilege. Foreign intelligence services began sharing information about Thompson's contacts that painted an even more disturbing picture. The sergeant had been in communication with individuals linked to several different intelligence organizations, suggesting that multiple foreign powers had been interested in the information he could provide. The scope of the betrayal was far greater than anyone had initially imagined. William found himself briefing senior government ministers on the situation, including the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary. The political implications were significant. A major security breach involving the royal family could affect Britain's relationships with allied nations and potentially compromise ongoing intelligence operations around the world. Catherine's public engagements were temporarily suspended as security teams worked to assess which events might have been compromised by Thompson's intelligence gathering. Her upcoming visit to a children's hospital was postponed, disappointing hundreds of patients and staff who had been looking forward to meeting her. The human cost of Thompson's betrayal was becoming increasingly apparent. The media's appetite for details about the scandal seemed insatiable. Journalists camped outside Thompson's former residence, interviewed his neighbors, and attempted to piece together his personal history. Every aspect of his life was scrutinized, from his military service record to his gambling habits to his romantic relationships. Palace staff members found themselves under intense scrutiny as investigators worked to determine whether Thompson had recruited additional sources within the royal household. Polygraph tests were administered to personnel with access to sensitive information, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that undermined the trust essential to effective royal security. The financial cost of the crisis continued to mount as security consultants were brought in to assess every aspect of the royal protection system. Emergency measures implemented immediately after Thompson's suspension were expensive and disruptive, but necessary to prevent further breaches while permanent solutions were developed. By the end of the third day, William realized that Thompson's suspension had unleashed forces that would reshape the monarchy's security apparatus for years to come. The consequences were spreading far beyond what anyone had anticipated when the sergeant was first confronted with evidence of his betrayal. The fourth day brought shocking news that changed everything. Thompson had been found dead in a hotel room in Brussels, apparently from a drug overdose. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team and raised disturbing questions about whether his death was accidental or something far more sinister. Belgian police contacted their British counterparts within hours of finding the body. Thompson's hotel room contained evidence of drug use, but also encrypted communication devices and documents that suggested he had been preparing to defect to a foreign intelligence service. The sergeant's death meant that crucial information about his network and activities might be lost forever. William received the news during his morning briefing with the new interim security chief. The prince's reaction was complex. Relief that Thompson could no longer cause damage was mixed with frustration that many questions would now never be answered. The investigation had taken a dark turn that no one had anticipated. Detective Inspector Collins flew to Brussels immediately to coordinate with local authorities and examine the evidence found in Thompson's hotel room. The scene suggested that the former sergeant had been living in fear during his final days. Multiple locks had been installed on the door, and surveillance equipment indicated he had been watching for potential threats. The discovery of Thompson's body triggered a media frenzy that dwarfed previous coverage of the scandal. International news outlets picked up the story, with speculation ranging from suicide to assassination by foreign agents. The royal family found themselves at the center of what was increasingly being portrayed as an international espionage thriller government. Officials at the highest levels became directly involved as Thompson's death raised questions about whether British intelligence assets had been compromised. The Prime Minister was briefed on the situation and authorized additional resources for the investigation. What had started as a royal household matter had become a national security priority. Inside the palace, the mood was somber as staff members grappled with the implications of Thompson's death. Many had known him personally and struggled to reconcile the colleague they remembered with the betrayer he had become. His death added a tragic dimension to a scandal that had already shaken the institution to its core. The Queen called William to a private meeting in her study. The conversation was difficult, with both grandmother and grandson acknowledging that the monarchy faced one of its most serious crises in decades. The institution's reputation for security and trustworthiness had been severely damaged, and Thompson's death had only made the situation more complicated. Catherine found herself increasingly isolated as security restrictions limited her movements and interactions. The woman who had once moved freely through her royal duties was now confined to a small circle of thoroughly vetted staff members. The psychological toll of living under such restrictions was beginning to show, particularly in her interactions with the children. Evidence found in Thompson's Brussels hotel room revealed the existence of at least 3 other potential security breaches within the royal household. Encrypted files on his laptop contained references to individuals identified only by code names, suggesting that his network had been larger and more sophisticated than investigators had realized. The Belgian investigation uncovered financial records showing that Thompson had received substantial payments from sources in at least 4 different countries over the past 18 months. The amounts were far larger than initially estimated, indicating that the information he had been selling was considered extremely valuable by foreign intelligence services. Prince Charles arrived at Windsor Castle for emergency consultations with William and senior advisors. The heir to the throne was deeply concerned about the long-term implications for the monarchy's relationship with the government and the public. Difficult decisions needed to be made about how much information to release and how to begin rebuilding public trust. The children's security arrangements were completely overhauled as investigators determined that Thompson had accessed detailed information about their daily routines, school schedules, and recreational activities. Prince George and Princess Charlotte were temporarily moved to a more secure location while new protocols were developed for their protection. Intelligence agencies from allied nations began sharing information about Thompson's contacts that revealed the international scope of his activities. The sergeant had been in communication with intelligence operatives from at least 6 different countries, suggesting that multiple foreign powers had been interested in the intelligence he could provide about the royal family's staff. Members throughout the royal household were required to undergo intensive background checks that went far beyond standard employment screening. Personal finances, family relationships, and social connections were all scrutinized as investigators worked to identify other potential security risks. The process was invasive and demoralizing for loyal employees. William's relationship with the media became increasingly strained as journalists pushed for more details about the investigation. Press conferences were limited and carefully controlled, but reporters continued to pursue independent investigations that sometimes conflicted with official statements. The palace found itself fighting a battle for narrative control that it was slowly losing. The financial implications of the security overhaul continued to mount as specialized consultants were brought in to assess every aspect of the royal protection system. The costs were enormous, but the alternative, accepting ongoing vulnerability to foreign intelligence operations, was unacceptable to both the royal family and the government. Thompson's death triggered a review of security procedures for all government personnel with access to sensitive information. The case had revealed vulnerabilities that extended far beyond the royal household, prompting a comprehensive examination of how Britain protected its most valuable secrets and most important people. Medical examiners in Brussels worked to determine the exact cause of Thompson's death while investigators analyzed the drugs found in his system. Preliminary results suggested a combination of substances that could have been accidentally lethal or deliberately administered. The uncertainty added another layer of complexity to an already complicated case. The palace's legal team struggled with questions about how much information could be released to the public without compromising ongoing investigations or national security. Every statement had to be carefully crafted to avoid revealing details that might help other foreign intelligence operations while still providing enough information to maintain public credibility. Catherine's public duties were gradually resumed under enhanced security measures that made her engagements noticeably different from previous events. The relaxed, informal style that had made her popular with the public was replaced by a more distant, heavily protected approach that reflected the new security realities. The investigation team worked around the clock to analyze evidence found in Thompson's hotel room and trace his activities during his final days. Every contact, every transaction, and every movement was examined for clues about his network and the information he might have shared before his death. By the end of the 4th day, Thompson's death had transformed the scandal from a security breach into something approaching an international incident with implications that reached far beyond the walls of any royal residence. The Belgian medical examiner's preliminary report arrived on the 5th day, bringing disturbing news that deepened the mystery surrounding Thompson's death. The former sergeant had died from a combination of drugs that toxicologists described as highly unusual, a mixture that could have been accidental, but showed patterns consistent with assassination by poisoning. William studied the medical report with growing alarm. Thompson had consumed a cocktail of substances that included a rare synthetic compound typically used by intelligence agencies for covert operations. The presence of this particular drug suggested that Thompson's death was no accident, but rather a deliberate elimination by professionals who wanted to silence him permanently. Detective Inspector Collins coordinated with Belgian authorities and international intelligence agencies to investigate the possibility that Thompson had been murdered. Hotel security footage showed several individuals entering and leaving the building during the hours before his death, but their identities remained unknown. The investigation had evolved from espionage to potential murder. The Queen convened an emergency meeting of the Privy Council to discuss the constitutional implications of the unfolding crisis. Thompson's apparent murder suggested that foreign intelligence services were willing to kill to protect their operations against the British royal family. The security threat had escalated to a level not seen since the height of the Cold War. Catherine's movements were further restricted as security analysts assessed whether she or other family members might be targets for similar attacks. The children were moved to an undisclosed location, under heavy protection while investigators worked to understand the full scope of the threat they faced. Intelligence agencies across Europe launched coordinated investigations into Thompson's network and the individuals who might have been responsible for his death. The case had become a priority for multiple governments as the implications of foreign intelligence operations against the British monarchy became clear. Parliamentary questions were raised about the government's handling of royal security and whether adequate resources had been devoted to protecting the institution. Opposition politicians demanded answers about how Thompson's recruitment had gone undetected for so long and what steps were being taken to prevent similar breaches. The palace's relationship with the press reached a new low as journalists published increasingly detailed accounts of the investigation. Leaked information appeared in newspapers almost daily, suggesting that the security around the investigation itself had been compromised. William suspected that some government officials were using media leaks to pressure the palace into greater cooperation. Prince Charles took on a more active role in managing the crisis, using his extensive network of government contacts to coordinate response efforts. His years of experience in dealing with sensitive political matters proved invaluable as the family navigated the complex intersection of royal protocol, national security, and international relations. The financial markets began to show signs of concern as the scandal's implications for British institutions became apparent. Currency traders and investors worried about the stability of the government and the potential for further revelations that might damage Britain's international reputation. Economic advisors warned that prolonged uncertainty could affect the country's credit rating. Evidence analysis from Thompson's hotel room revealed encrypted communications with at least 12 different individuals across 7 countries. The sophistication of the communication methods suggested that Thompson had been working with a well-funded and highly organized intelligence network. The royal family had been targeted by what appeared to be a multinational espionage operation. Staff morale within the palace reached crisis levels as employees struggled with the constant security reviews, background checks, and surveillance. Many long-serving staff members submitted resignations, unable to cope with the atmosphere of suspicion and the invasive nature of the ongoing investigation. The royal household was hemorrhaging institutional knowledge and experience. William found himself spending increasing amounts of time in meetings with intelligence officials, government ministers, and security consultants. His normal royal duties were largely suspended as he worked to understand the threat and develop appropriate responses. The prince was effectively functioning as the coordinator of a complex counterintelligence operation. The children's education was disrupted as security concerns made their normal school attendance impossible. Private tutors were brought in under strict security protocols, but the isolation was taking a psychological toll on both Prince George and Princess Charlotte. The family structure that William and Catherine had worked hard to maintain was crumbling under the pressure international diplomatic channels. Buzzed with communications as allied governments sought to understand whether their own royal families or government officials might be targets of similar operations. The Thompson case had revealed vulnerabilities that extended far beyond the British royal family, prompting a comprehensive review of security arrangements across Europe. The palace's insurance carriers became involved as the financial implications of the security overhaul became clear. Coverage for royal family protection had never contemplated the costs associated with defending against sophisticated international espionage operations. Negotiations began for additional coverage that would cost millions of pounds annually. New evidence emerged suggesting that Thompson's gambling debts might have been artificially created by his intelligence handlers as a way to make him more vulnerable to recruitment. The debts that had initially appeared to be the root cause of his betrayal were revealed to be part of a sophisticated manipulation designed to compromise his loyalty. Medical experts examined the specific drugs found in Thompson's system and determined that the combination would have caused a painful but relatively quick death. The choice of poisons suggested that his killers had wanted to send a message to other potential sources while ensuring that he could not reveal additional information about their operations. The Queen's annual schedule was completely revised as security analysts determined which events might present unacceptable risks given the ongoing threats. Several traditional engagements were cancelled, including some that had been held continuously for decades. The monarchy's public face was being fundamentally altered by security concerns. Catherine began experiencing anxiety attacks as the stress of the situation took its toll. The woman who had handled public scrutiny with grace for years found herself overwhelmed by the combination of isolation, fear for her children's safety, and uncertainty about the future. Medical support was quietly arranged to help her cope with the psychological pressure. The investigation team expanded to include specialists in international organized crime as evidence suggested that Thompson's network might have connections to criminal organizations, as well as intelligence agencies. The distinction between espionage and organized crime was becoming blurred as investigators traced the financial flows and communication patterns. By the end of the fifth day, the Thompson case had evolved into something that threatened not just the royal family's security, but the stability of British institutions and the country's relationships with its allies. The consequences of suspending one corrupt guard had spiraled far beyond anything William could have imagined when he first confronted Thompson with evidence of his betrayal. The sixth day brought a breakthrough that would reshape the entire investigation. Cryptographers working around the clock finally cracked the encryption on Thompson's communication devices, revealing the identities of his handlers and the full scope of the intelligence operation that had targeted the royal family. The decrypted messages painted a chilling picture of a 3-year operation designed to gather comprehensive intelligence on every aspect of the royal family's security, personal relationships, and future plans. Thompson had been just one part of a much larger network that included palace staff, government employees, and even members of parliament who had been recruited or compromised by foreign intelligence services. William sat in stunned silence as intelligence officials briefed him on the contents of the decoded communications. The operation had been far more sophisticated and comprehensive than anyone had imagined. Foreign agents had been systematically mapping the entire British establishment, using the royal family as their primary target and entry point into the highest levels of government. The messages revealed that Thompson's murder had been ordered when his handlers realized that his exposure would inevitably lead to the discovery of their broader network. His death was intended to sever the connection between the compromised sergeant and the larger operation, but the encryption had preserved evidence that would prove far more damaging than anything Thompson could have revealed while alive. Detective Inspector Collins coordinated with international law enforcement agencies to begin arresting members of the spy network across multiple countries. The operation, codenamed Crown Jewel, involved simultaneous raids in London, Brussels, Prague, and Moscow. The scale of the investigation had grown to encompass intelligence agencies from a dozen different nations. The revelation that members of Parliament had been compromised triggered a constitutional crisis that reached the highest levels of government. The Prime Minister called an emergency meeting of the cabinet to discuss the implications of foreign intelligence penetration into the heart of British democracy. Several MPs were quietly approached by security services for questioning. Catherine's security detail was tripled as investigators determined that she had been specifically targeted for surveillance and potential recruitment. Foreign agents had compiled detailed psychological profiles of both her and William, looking for vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The invasion of their privacy was complete and deeply disturbing. The palace's communication systems were completely replaced as technicians discovered evidence of sophisticated electronic surveillance that had been ongoing for years. Every phone call, email, and text message had potentially been monitored by foreign intelligence services. The royal family had been living under constant surveillance without realizing it. Prince Charles emerged as a key figure in coordinating the government's response to the crisis. His decades of experience in dealing with sensitive political matters and his extensive international contacts proved invaluable as Britain worked with allies to understand the full scope of the foreign intelligence operation. The financial cost of the security overhaul reached unprecedented levels as every aspect of royal protection was rebuilt from scratch. The total bill was estimated to exceed £50 million, making it one of the most expensive security operations in British history. Parliament would need to approve emergency funding to cover the costs. Evidence emerged that Thompson's gambling addiction had been deliberately encouraged and exploited by his handlers over a period of more than 2 years. They had introduced him to underground gambling establishments, provided inside information that allowed him to win initially, and then manipulated the odds to create massive debts that made him vulnerable to recruitment. The Queen made the difficult decision to cancel her upcoming state visit to Germany as security analysts determined that the trip would present unacceptable risks given the ongoing investigation. The cancellation embarrassed the government and damaged Britain's diplomatic relationships at a time when international cooperation was essential. Intelligence agencies discovered that the foreign operation had been using advanced artificial intelligence systems to analyze the intercepted communications and identify patterns that could predict royal family behavior. The technological sophistication of the operation was far beyond what traditional intelligence analysis could achieve. Staff members throughout the government underwent emergency security screening as investigators worked to identify other potential sources within the British establishment. The process was disruptive and expensive, but necessary to prevent further intelligence leaks while the investigation continued. William's military contacts proved invaluable as he worked with intelligence professionals to understand the threat and develop countermeasures. His experience in military intelligence helped him grasp the sophisticated nature of the operation and the long-term implications for British security. The children's psychological well-being became a major concern as the isolation and security restrictions took their toll. Child psychologists were consulted to help Prince George and Princess Charlotte cope with the dramatic changes to their daily lives. The family's attempt to provide a normal childhood for their children was being severely tested. International allies began sharing intelligence about similar operations that had been detected in their own countries. The Thompson case had exposed what appeared to be a coordinated global intelligence operation targeting Western democratic institutions and their symbols of stability and continuity. The palace's relationship with the media deteriorated further as journalists published increasingly detailed accounts of the security measures being implemented. The coverage made it difficult to maintain operational security while conducting the ongoing investigation. Some media outlets were suspected of being influenced by the same foreign intelligence services that had recruited Thompson. Parliamentary hearings were scheduled to examine the security failures that had allowed the operation to continue undetected for so long. Members of Parliament demanded answers about government oversight of royal security and whether adequate resources had been devoted to protecting national institutions. The investigation revealed that foreign agents had been using social media and online platforms to gather additional intelligence about the royal family and their associates. Advanced data mining techniques had been employed to analyze public information and identify potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Medical experts concluded that Thompson's murder had been carried out by professionals with access to sophisticated poisons and detailed knowledge of their effects. The execution suggested that his handlers were willing to eliminate their own assets to protect the broader operation, a level of ruthlessness that alarmed intelligence. Professionals Catherine's public engagements were indefinitely suspended as security teams worked to assess which events might have been compromised by the intelligence operation. The suspension effectively removed one of the monarchy's most popular figures from public view, just when the institution needed to maintain public confidence. By the end of the 6th day, the full scope of the foreign intelligence operation was becoming clear, and the implications for British security and the monarchy's future were staggering. The Thompson case had revealed vulnerabilities that would take years to address, and had fundamentally changed how the royal family would live and work. 6 months after Thompson's suspension, the full consequences of the scandal continued to reshape the British monarchy and government institutions. William stood in his renovated office, looking out at the transformed security landscape that now surrounded Windsor Castle. The walls were higher, the technology more sophisticated, and the atmosphere forever changed by the events that had begun with one corrupt guard. The final report of the parliamentary inquiry was published, revealing the stunning scope of foreign intelligence penetration into British institutions. 17 government employees, including 3 members of Parliament, had been arrested in connection with the spy network. The damage to Britain's reputation as a secure and trustworthy ally would take years to repair. Catherine had gradually returned to public duties, but under security arrangements that made her previous freedom seem like a distant memory. Every engagement was now planned with military precision, and her interactions with the public were limited and carefully controlled. The spontaneous moments that had made her so popular were largely eliminated by security requirements. The children had adapted to their new reality with the resilience that William and Catherine had worked hard to instill in them. Prince George and Princess Charlotte attended a new school with enhanced security measures, and their social interactions were limited to carefully vetted families. The normal childhood that their parents had hoped to provide was no longer possible. The financial cost of the security overhaul had exceeded initial estimates, reaching nearly £75 million. Parliament had approved the emergency funding, but not without heated debates about the monarchy's relevance in the modern world, and whether such enormous security expenditures were justified. Public support for the royal family had declined significantly during the crisis. Detective Inspector Collins had been promoted and now headed a new joint intelligence unit dedicated to protecting British institutions from foreign infiltration. The Thompson case had become a textbook example of how modern intelligence operations could exploit traditional vulnerabilities in established organizations. The Queen had weathered the crisis with her characteristic stoicism, but those close to her reported that the scandal had taken a significant toll. At her advanced age, the stress of seeing the institution she had served for decades under such intense scrutiny and threat had been exhausting. She had privately expressed concerns about the monarchy's future stability. Prince Charles had emerged as a key figure in the reform process, working closely with government officials to develop new security protocols for the royal family. His experience and political connections had been invaluable during the crisis, and his role in managing the response had enhanced his reputation as a future king who could handle complex challenges. The palace staff had been almost entirely replaced as the security review identified numerous potential vulnerabilities among long-serving employees. The institutional knowledge and personal relationships that had defined the royal household for generations were lost, replaced by professional staff with extensive security backgrounds, but little understanding of royal traditions. Intelligence agencies had established a permanent presence at royal residences, with officers assigned to monitor communications, analyze threats, and coordinate with international partners. The informal family-like atmosphere that had characterized the royal household was replaced by the structured environment of a high-security government facility. The media's relationship with the royal family had been fundamentally altered by the scandal. Press access was severely limited, and traditional arrangements that had allowed journalists to cover royal events were replaced by tightly controlled information releases. The transparency that had helped Modernize the monarchy was sacrificed for security. Concerns. International allies had implemented similar security. Reviews of their own institutions after learning about the sophistication of the foreign intelligence operation. The Thompson case had revealed vulnerabilities that extended far beyond the British royal family, prompting a global reassessment of how democratic institutions protected themselves from infiltration. William had been forced to develop expertise in intelligence matters and national security that went far beyond traditional royal training. His daily schedule now included regular briefings on threat assessments, security protocols, and international intelligence developments. The role of future king had evolved to include responsibilities that previous generations of royals had never imagined. The scandal had accelerated discussions about the monarchy's future role in British society. Public opinion polls showed declining support for the institution, with many questioning whether the enormous security costs were justified in the modern world. Republican movements that had been marginal for decades began gaining mainstream political support. Thompson's death remained officially classified as murder, but the individuals responsible had never been identified or apprehended. The case served as a constant reminder that foreign intelligence services remained active and dangerous, willing to kill to protect their operations. The threat had not disappeared with Thompson's death. It had simply become more sophisticated and harder to detect. The technological infrastructure supporting royal security had been completely modernized, with artificial intelligence systems monitoring communications and analyzing potential threats in real time. The romantic image of royal guards in traditional uniforms had been supplemented by cybersecurity experts and intelligence analysts working behind the scenes. Catherine's mental health had stabilized with professional support, but the carefree confidence that had made her such an effective royal representative had been replaced by a more cautious and guarded public persona. The woman who had once charmed crowds with her natural warmth now maintained the professional distance necessary for her security. Parliament had passed new legislation, strengthening background check requirements for government employees and establishing harsher penalties for espionage. The Thompson case had exposed gaps in existing security procedures that had been exploited by foreign intelligence services for years. The royal family's relationship with the public had been permanently altered by the security requirements imposed after the scandal. The accessibility that had helped modernize the monarchy was reduced, creating distance between the institution and the people it served. Public events were fewer, more formal, and less spontaneous. As William reflected on the past 6 months, he understood that Thompson's suspension had triggered changes that would define the monarchy for generations to come. The simple act of confronting one corrupt guard had unleashed forces that transformed not just royal security, but the entire relationship between the crown, the government, and the people of Britain. The palace had survived the crisis, but it had been fundamentally changed in the process. The institution that emerged from the Thompson scandal was more secure but less accessible, more professional but less personal, and more protected but also more isolated from the society it was meant to serve.